Welcome to this first episode of the Binary Agora. Through in-depth analysis with leading researchers, we'll navigate the evolving landscape of legal tech, uncovering its challenges, innovations, and real-world impact. Today, I will discuss my most recent working paper addressing the complex interplay and intersection of vertical interoperability in its regulation via the European regulation tackling digital market power, the European Digital Markets Act or DMA. I have divided the presentation into three sections to make it easier to follow. In essence, I will be talking about a new form and intensity of interoperability that has emerged from the DMA. For that, I will do a first quick recap of the DMA's institutional design as well as its vertical interoperability mandate. Once we have gained sufficient knowledge about the regulatory background and its limitations, I will also highlight how the European Commission aims to transform Apple's model, in particular to meet the legal requirements set out in the European regulation. And finally, I will translate these efforts into identifiable legal principles which may give us quite a targeted flavor of the regulatory direction the Commission intends to introduce in the regulatory digital sphere. Given that the DMA is a new piece of regulation, I will briefly underscore a few points about its adoption and its institutional framework. First of all, what is it? The DMA does not directly pursue the protection of undistorted functioning of competition. In fact, the underlying premise of the regulation is that some digital markets are already distorted, so that regulation is necessary to correct those same distortions. The main objectives of the DMA are therefore to ensure contestable and fair markets for precisely these digital services. Contestability aims to ensure that no barriers to entry and expansion exist when competitors try to outsmart the incumbent big tech companies. In turn, fairness intends to restore the imbalances in the rights and the obligations of competitors vis-à-vis those that gatekeepers possess due to their position. The funny thing about the DMA is that the obligations it imposes on the regulatory targets to try to ensure contestable and fair markets come precisely from the antitrust framework. Basically, the remedies proposed by competition authorities in sanctioning proceedings are now enshrined as both prescriptive and prescriptive obligations under Articles 5, 6, and 7. For the particular example of the vertical interoperability mandate that we will be talking about in a few minutes, Article 6.7 of the DMA, the Microsoft tying case brought by the European Commission in the early 2000s, as well as the analysis of the closed-off payment systems brought by the digital platforms and ecosystems inspired this regulatory action. In parallel, the DMA also addresses fragmentation in the European internal market, meaning that the regulation is the only set of rules to address digital rulemaking at the EU level. The European Union realized that it could not have 27 different regulations impacting the biggest digital tech firms in the world, and that was precisely what some of the member states were doing at the national level. Due to this reason, the DMA's enforcement is centralized, and the European Commission is the only one to interpret and to analyze compliance with the regulation. Moving along those lines, the DMA differs from antitrust in that it is not a horizontal regulation. It does not apply to every single service in the economy or to every single service catered by a digital platform. Instead, it is an asymmetrical regulation, so that the regulatory targets, the so-called gatekeepers, will only remain impacted by the DMA to the extent that there is a previous Commission decision designating their gatekeeper status. I'm not going to get into the details of designation now, but for the purpose of this presentation, the relevant aspect to know is that the European Commission designated in September 2023 and April-May 2024 seven gatekeepers: Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, Microsoft, and Booking.com for 24 core platform services. For instance, not all of Alphabet's services remain captured by the regulation. Only its Google Maps, Play, Shopping, Chrome, Ads, or its YouTube and Android services. For a particular topic, we must observe in this sense the third column of this table surrounding the gatekeepers, i.e., those services captured by the regulation concerning Apple, its App Store, both its operating systems iOS and iPadOS, and its web browser Safari. What does that mean in practice? It means that the DMA's provisions apply only to those services. The regulatory instrument holds interoperability as one of its key instruments to open formally closed or locked-in digital ecosystems. Interoperability means the ability of two or more systems to effectively exchange and use information. Despite it is not so new as a remedy in the antitrust framework, the DMA enshrines interoperability in two different ways, via horizontal and vertical interoperability. Horizontal interoperability applies between operators at the same level of the value chain. In the particular case of Article 7, it compels messaging service operators, the only one designated as a gatekeeper is WhatsApp alongside Facebook's messenger service, to provide access to their features and functionalities to their competitors. The access seekers in this case are the incumbents' direct competitors, catering to the same value proposition to the user. On the contrary, vertical interoperability under Article 6.7 applies between operators at different levels of the value chain, normally an upstream operator vis-à-vis a downstream access seeker. The vertical interoperability mandate applies to those gatekeepers with a designated operating system, namely Apple for its iOS and iPadOS, Alphabet for its Android, and Microsoft for its Windows PCOS. The obligation aims to provide access to complementers of these operating system providers, catering to different systems and services with different value propositions, relying on the gatekeeper's proprietary technologies and functionalities. The application of the vertical interoperability mandate under Article 6.7 is astonishingly relevant, since also it requires profound changes in terms of the design of its business model. As you'll see in the slide, Article 6.7 establishes that the gatekeeper, in this case Apple, shall allow providers of services and providers of hardware effective interoperability with the same hardware and software features accessed or controlled via the operating system. In other words, Apple must allow third-party access seekers to access the hardware and the software features operated by its iOS and its iPadOS. Why is that so relevant? Because many digital ecosystems, including Apple's, do not provide third-party access to operators in downstream markets to the functionalities or features it operates via its operating system. Let's set an example so that it is a bit clearer. Imagine that you have an iPhone, and for those who own them, I bet that you may have encountered connectivity problems when trying to pair your headsets to an iPhone, especially when those headsets are not proprietary technology of Apple's. Why is that, would you ask? Because Apple denies access to equivalent functionality it accesses to cast audio on its devices. Furthermore, the provision under Article 6.7 of the DMA introduces two really relevant features. When providing such an access, Apple cannot charge a fee for the access seekers to those features and functionalities. The obligation establishes that such access must be produced free of charge. Additionally, the conditions by which access seekers must be granted such access must be equivalent to those enjoyed by the gatekeeper. In the terms of Article 6.7, they must be rendered as are available to the services or hardware provided by the gatekeeper. And now, let me make a brief detour from the letter of the law. Interoperability, whether horizontal or vertical, consists of 4 different layers of integration between 2 or more IT systems, as explored by research on the technological capacities of these systems. The underlying foundation of every interoperability solution consists on the technical aspect of interoperability. The access provider and the access seeker must agree on the hardware and the software features used as the conditions for the exchange. Without them, there is no possibility to interoperate, since the underlying technology will be different. Once technical interoperability is achieved, the seeker and the provider must have the ability to exchange data. That is to say, information must be channeled through the hardware and the software components laid down by technical interoperability. Such an exchange does not ensure comprehension because that's the role of the semantic aspect of the interoperability. Humans, and not machines, must set out common semantics for their systems to be able to interpret and use the data which has been exchanged. Only when the technical, syntactic, and semantic aspects of interoperability have been fulfilled, the last tenet of interoperability, organizational interoperability, can be achieved. The organizational layer ensures the organization's capabilities to effectively communicate and transfer meaningful data, despite the use of a variety of systems. Different organizations collaborate, share resources, and align their processes and goals as a result of successful organizational interoperability. As we will see later on, the European Commission's intervention in fleshing out the vertical interoperability mandate follows the same scheme of things. And going back to Article 6.7, the provision establishes an exception to the application of the obligation. Providing access to such features entails security risks for the gatekeeper, so that the European regulation recognizes that the gatekeeper may adopt strictly necessary, proportionate, and duly justified measures to ensure that granting access does not compromise the integrity of the operating system. That is, the gatekeeper may come up with reasons justifying its refusal to grant access to some features or even some aspects of those features. If you remember, when we talked about the DMA and its complementarity with antitrust, I said that in principle, both types of intervention do not share common ground nor a shared theoretical foundation. Recently, however, we have seen that the Court of Justice of the European Union issued a preliminary ruling precisely on the topic of granting vertical interoperability to a digital platform. This is the perfect example to learn about how well the system designed by the DMA fares against the antitrust standards. In this particular example, Google denied a downstream app operator, Enel, access to its templates of apps to be integrated into a car's integrated display, Android Auto. In the meantime, Google displayed third-party apps relating to both messaging and multimedia, but did not grant access to Enel's app offering a set of mapping features for charging electric vehicles. Google brought forward security concerns and the need to allocate the resources necessary to create a new template for a new type of app to deny access to Enel's app on its Android Auto system. Stemming from Enel's complaint to the Italian Competition Authority, the conduct was termed as an abuse of a dominant position in the form of a refusal to grant access to its competitors. In the meantime, and once the proceedings had already been triggered, Google released a template for designing experimental charging apps compatible with Android Auto. The Court of Justice recognized that the conduct, even if it was found abusive, could be objectively justified when the template would exactly compromise the integrity or security of the platform, or where the development of the template would be technically impossible to try to ensure interoperability. Outside of those reasons, the dominant operator devoting any reasonable period of time to the development and therefore not to granting direct access may also be regarded as objectively necessary and proportionate according to the court, bearing in mind the needs of the access seeker and the difficulties in developing the template. In light of these limitations, the Court of Justice recognizes that Article 102 of the treaty, that is the prohibition of an abuse, does not preclude the dominant undertaking from requiring an appropriate financial contribution from the access seeker for rendering access, and not necessarily for acquiring end users on that same app. Article 6.7 of the DMA, however, is not quite so nuanced as the antitrust framework. The provision compels free of charge access and presents integrity and security reasons not as a mean not to not comply with the provision, but rather as a targeted and exceptionally applicable exception which must be applied by the gatekeeper in a small number of cases to avoid compromising the operating system's integrity. In fact, the European Commission's enforcement action against Apple demonstrates these same points. Following the application of Article 6.7 of the DMA, Apple presented its idea of a compliance solution to the provision in March 2024. On its compliance report, as you'll see in the slide, Apple basically set out two different aspects of its compliance. First, it defended that its interoperability efforts encompass more than 250,000 APIs, enabling developers to leverage the core technologies built into iOS and iPadOS so that users can access them right from the developers' apps. And second, it introduced a dedicated compliance solution to attend to the DMA's legal requirements around vertical interoperability. In doing so, it introduced a new request form by which access seekers would direct their interoperability request to the gatekeeper. At that moment, Apple could already reject them on the grounds of their falling outside of the scope of Article 6.7 or due to the fact that there were available features catering to the functionalities requested by the access seekers. In case the request was accepted, then Apple would draw up a tentative project plan without the developer's feedback to try to accommodate its request. Once again, at this time, Apple could reject its request because it was not, for instance, technically feasible or because it was inappropriate to do so under the DMA. Following the completion of Phase 2, Apple would develop and release the interoperability solution at any given point in time without notifying the access seeker prior to its launch. The enforcer, however, disagreed that the implementation met the effective interoperability threshold. At present, the enforcer has triggered 2 specification proceedings against Apple to comply with Article 6.7 of the DMA. And what's a specification proceeding? It's a non-punitive procedure opened by the European Commission with the aim to adopt and implement an act to specify the measures that the gatekeeper must implement in order to effectively comply with any given DMA provision, in this case, Article 6.7 of the DMA. The objective of these proceedings is to impose a range of implementation measures to be followed up by the gatekeeper to transform its business model in the likeness of the European Commission's idea of effective compliance. The European Commission triggered 2 distinct specification proceedings against Apple in September 2024. The first proceeding relates to iOS interoperability with third-party connected physical devices, such as smartwatches or headsets. The second one, however, concerns Apple's request-based process, which the European Commission considered not meeting the interoperability by design principle required by Article 6.7. In particular, the enforcer highlighted the need to make the process more transparent and subject to accountability metrics, since Apple did not provide for any of those with its proposed compliance solution. As a result, it issued, the European Commission, preliminary findings in both cases in December 2024, setting out the implementation measures it believes Apple should introduce to meet the regulatory threshold. It is precisely these measures that we consider to analyze what notion of vertical interoperability the European Commission has introduced anew via the DMA mandate. On the side of the first specification proceedings relating to third-party connected physical devices, the enforcer highlights 11 features that Apple must grant equivalent and equal access to access seekers to introduce the first 3 tenets of interoperability: technical, syntactic, and semantic. In other words, Apple, for instance, must make available to access seekers all the functionality available to itself relating to its automatic audio switching with its headsets or its AirDrop and AirPlay feature. In my own mind, the most important tenet to bear in mind is that the European Commission does not simply introduce all these implementation measures on a standalone basis. Instead, it presents them in a clustered approach where, for example, the AirPlay functionality, enabling the sharing of audio, video, and screen content from an iPhone to a connected device, such as a smart TV, depends on Apple's media casting features as well as on its communication protocols relating to its high bandwidth peer-to-peer Wi-Fi connection, so that the interoperability solution can be effectively interoperable. In doing so, the European Commission presents a nuanced but also complex task for Apple to realize, since every feature depends on the others to work in practice. This will entail Apple's compliance and complete reworking of its functioning as regards interoperability and access on its devices. On the side of the second process, relating to its request-based process or the ticketing service, the enforcer is most concerned with the organizational aspect of interoperability. As you'll see in the slide, the European Commission redefines every single phase of Apple's proposed ticketing system and replaces it with a more just, transparent, and fair process by which access seekers may send interoperability requests to the gatekeeper. For instance, on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that the European Commission stresses the importance of making readily available information to the access seekers so that they can learn on what grounds they stand on when formulating their request. Apple is thus compelled to answer those requests for information by the access seekers so that they can gain access to the whole picture of their interoperability opportunities. In parallel, the enforcer also introduced a number of chances where the access seekers may contest the gatekeeper's decisions in designing the interoperability solution. Building on the implementation measures presented by the European Commission on both these specification proceedings, I believe we can reach a clear conclusion. The DMA's idea of vertical interoperability entails introducing an equivalence of input regime, like those in telecoms regulation. This was not apparently clear or evident from the letter of the law. Maybe you'll recall that Article 6.7 requires to provide effective interoperability. In principle, effectiveness does not entail that access seekers must be rendered with equal results when gaining access to the gatekeeper's features and functionalities. Instead, effectiveness means the gatekeeper must achieve the provision's desired result, which is to provide access to providers of hardware and software. Even though that's what Article 6.7 reads to, it's not what the European Commission has interpreted through its two specification proceedings, perhaps due to the proximity of one of its directorates, DG Connect, with regards to telecoms regulation. In practice, the enforcer defines an equivalence of input regime, as opposed to an equivalence of output regime, where access seekers must be granted equal functionality. The enforcer's reading of the obligation introduces equality in terms of both infrastructure and process for interoperability to blossom to life. In fact, the defining principles of the enforcer's proceedings signal that interoperability solutions for access seekers must be equally effective and provided under equal conditions. On top of that, Apple must also refrain from making the conditions rendering access to those interoperability solutions as opaque, unfair, unreasonable, or discriminatory. De facto, the European Commission places a high threshold of intervention on the gatekeeper to make its decisions as reasonable as possible when granting access to its proprietary technologies, features, and functionalities. Having said that, why should we care about the Commission's introduction of this legal principle? First of all, interoperability is the beating heart of any digital business model relying on the big tech digital platforms. Second, third-party access seekers now have great opportunities to exercise their rights to vertical interoperability within Apple's ecosystems. which can impact innovators creating new services and apps for iOS, as well as leveling the playing field for those existing downstream access seekers with a downgraded version of their services. Most importantly, however, I believe that these first steps demonstrate a clear direction in the DMA's interpretation by the European Commission. All obligations under the regulatory instrument will be stretched out with supporting legal principles that do not necessarily correspond with the regulation's letter of the law. Not only Apple, but other gatekeepers might be subject to similar enforcement actions. In this sense, the dynamics of interoperability access seekers and access providers may fundamentally change as stemming from the Commission's enforcement, since interoperability solutions must be streamlined by Apple to make them fit as many use cases as possible, despite the targeted and nuanced needs of every single downstream developer. In general, however, the two cases demonstrate the enforcer's clear predilection to assimilate the vertical interoperability obligation to the equivalence of input regime of telecoms regulation. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, I invite you to follow the link below or in the description to access the full paper on SSRN. And if you have any feedback or any comments, write down your thoughts in the comment section and I'll be happy to take any questions. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel and I will see you back on the next episode.